Hey, what's up guys? Nick the Informative Fisherman here, and today we're going to be breaking down float and fly very thoroughly. This is much more of an advanced video. I may skip over a lot of the basics in this video. I've seen quite a few videos out there on the subject. All of them seem to touch certain areas, and there's good information out there, but I want to talk about the three features of float and fly. That's the fixed float and fly, the slip float and fly, and the bottom float and fly. That's a tactic that I like to consider myself an expert on. The other two I've done a lot, but I am not an expert at those, but I know the expert rigging. I know how to do it. I've just not done it 1,000 times like the other guys, but I'm going to break it down and give you guys some inside information that you probably never heard about float and fly, and some other expert tips to go along with it to help you perfect probably what you already know and fill in some of those blanks to things you did not know. So let's get started. Now essentially all float and fly is a bobber and a crappie jig. We prettied it up by calling it float and fly to make it sound more technical for you guys, but it's a bobber and a crappie jig no matter how you want to look at it. Now the first most common method of float and fly is a fixed bobber. That's when you squeeze that down, you can twist it around, and your bobber's set to a fixed length. Now let me show you why that's critical. Now, I've got a really short leader right here. Now, normally with a float and fly, we're setting it on a fixed float and fly, probably up to 7 or 8 feet maximal. It's very hard to cast a really long leader below your float, but we're going to explain how to do that, why to do that versus a slip bobber, and when to do that slip bobber. What I want to show you with a fixed float and fly, if I twitch this float at all on a tight line, it's going to make my little fly react immediately. If the fish touches it and comes up on that fly at all, my float's going to fall immediately. Now, what's critical to any assortment of float and fly, whether it's a slip bobber, a bottom float and fly, or a fixed float and fly, is that your float floats 90 degrees. And you're going to see other tactics where guys are using round bobbers or little corks. I like a stick bobber / round bobber variation. This is the Rocket Bobber by Bill Lewis Outdoors. It comes in 3 different sizes, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. The reason for is it's a long range casting float. You can cast it very far. Some guys like to use like the little styrofoam ones like this, a slip bobber where your line runs straight through the middle. That's really nice, but it's super light. The basis of float and fly is cold, clear, clean water. I mean, it's gin clean. We want to stay back from these fish. We're ultra finessing them. So I like a weighted float, and the Rocket Bobber cast a country mile for them. Now, there's a couple different retrieves with a fixed float and fly that you need to know. Casting it out, letting it fall, and sit there for a second is critical. It's just like dead sticking a worm. When the worm falls and lands on the bottom, let it sit there for a minute. If a big fish seen it, she may be making her way over there. She may think it's an easy meal and pick it up at that very moment once it hits the bottom, or a second or two after that. Now, from there, once it falls and it is suspended on them, because we're still talking about the fixed float and fly, we're not talking about the bottom variation again. So this is fixed. You see fish 7 foot deep, you can set your leader to 7 foot deep, or you can set it just above their head. If you're trying to pull a bigger fish out of suspended fish that you see, having your fly above them by a couple feet is the tactic to get the bigger fish to come out. Also, if you want to catch more fish out of a school you see on the float and fly, you fish above them, not in them, not under them, because when you hook one, you spook the school and they tend to follow. If you're just above them and encourage one at a time to come out and get it, you can catch multiple fish out of that school. Now, the tactic I like to do is referred to as dancing, where I'll take my rod and I'll shake my rod, and it's just twitching the float, and it's just making the fly just barely dance down there. It gets a heck of a lot of tension, and it looks like something wounded at that point, and they're going to come get it. Initially, the float and fly tactic with a fixed float, the basis of a fixed float is if I have 3 feet of line out, or it doesn't really matter, no matter how far I pull my float forward, if I jerk it 4 feet, this is going to go tight line, and it's going to swing and present my bait in a pendulum motion. Okay, it's going to pull it up in the water column, and it's going to swing back through, which could look like a shad. Very easily, it can look like a shad. Anything you want to make it match. You can use You can use a fly that looks more like a bluegill. I didn't bring it, but there's greenish, goldish colors and flies like that you can make it look just like a bluegill to present it. So you have the pulling pendulum tactic, you have the dancing tactic when it's suspended in that middle of the water column, but you always want to let it fall to a tight line and sit for a couple seconds first. A lot of your big strikes come a second or two after it falls on that tight line. Now, that is your fixed float and fly. That's for suspended fish. This bait is going in the middle of the water column, fishing above those fish. Unless you can't get bit and you try multiple times, get closer and closer and closer, never start in them, never start below them, always start above. Here's my little bluegill fly right there, because I was using it out back. I forgot I had it tied on. So here is the slip bobber. What a slip bobber is a knot that slides up on your line, pulls off a little sleeve. If you don't know how to rig a slip bobber, look that up. This is much more of an advanced video. To a bead, and now a slip bobber, and you're gonna notice I have that exact same rocket bobber on there, to a little tiny size 12 barrel swivel. Why do I use the size 12? It's extremely weightless. It doesn't affect the line. A lot of the time float and fly fishing, you're gonna get line twist unless your fly's on the heavier end. The lighter you go, the more line twist you're gonna get by shaking your float. When you're shaking it around, line twist is gonna happen, and I kinda like it that the float is not knocking the fish in the face when I reel down to it, although it is not required that you use a swivel. So now all this is I can set this knot as high up to go as deeper or as shallow as I want. The reason why I'm going to use a slip bobber is, let's say I'm finding fish beyond 10 feet deep. I can fish a fixed float and fly to those fish that are in 10 foot and 7. So I'm fishing about a 7 or 8 foot leader. So it's only a couple feet over their top of their head. But once fish are beyond 10 foot deep, that slip bobber is critical. I could set this 20 feet up my line. A lot of the time you might want to use 2 stops, get it really, really tight, and cut those tag ends off there very short. And you want to use a rod with larger guides. Micro guides are not going to work. When that knot has to go through there, steelhead rods with bigger guides on there, and you want to use a spinning rod, are going to be critical for getting that knot through there. Now, the reason why I have that same rocket bobber on there is I have a variation on a rocket bobber. You can set it like this, and you'll see an opening, or you can pull it back and twist it around, and you can go fixed bobber, or you can turn it around and you can go slip bobber. So it's nice. I can take that float off of there, hook it back on the rod, reel it up tight when I'm not using it, and I don't have a bobber stuck to my line. So it gives me the option there. Now, along with that slip bobber, let me put that back on there and show you some things you can and cannot do. So, if you drop down your bait, okay, you could shake it. You can dance your float a little bit and it'll shake it, but it is not as sensitive as a fixed bobber. If you pull your float forward, you're basically pulling your line up to your float. It's very, very hard to pendulum. You can't do that pendulum tactic with a float and fly. You can shake it a little bit. You just only want to shake it for a second or two at a time, because it'll start to work your bobber back down and it'll start to bring your line back up. Anytime you're shaking a float and fly on a slip bobber, you're actually lifting your fly back up, and you may be removing it out of the strike zone. So a little shake and stop is what you need. Unless there's a good amount of wind chop, then a lot of the time that's going to work that bait for you. So remember, same principle applies. Once it gets down, hits that bead, your float's going to turn upright, and you now know you're on the bottom. Now, I'll explain knowing when you're on the bottom and when you're not on the bottom, but that's what I do in regards to the slip bobber float and fly. If my fish are deeper than 10 feet, I need to use the slip bobber. I can't do the pendulum tactic that I can on a fixed float and fly, but still there's a time and place in Northern California, these deeper Clear Lakes, Shasta, Oroville. This is a much, much more effective rig than the fixed float and fly. But you go to a shallower lake out here behind my house, my fixed float and fly is used way more often than the slip float and fly, and it's more versatile in regards to retrieval and cadence tactics to get more bites. Now let's go to the bottom rig. Hang with us, guys. We'll be right back. Bigger, better, badder. The evolution of the buzzbait is upon us. The Evolution Baits Grass Burner is a high-performance bass snatching machine. High-end components, inline displacement, larger profile, balanced body for fast or slower retrieves, better deflection, and oversized treble hooks. You wouldn't bring a slingshot to a gunfight, would you? Find out more at evolutionbaits.com. You ever heard of Cal Coast Fishing's Rod Mule? For super convenient rod transfer or storage? And how about the Bait Sack, a puncture-proof, clip-on bait protector that comes in an assortment of sizes? Or maybe you're looking for the best non-puncture culling system with Cal Coast Fishing Clip and Call. And it wouldn't be complete without a money beam. I trust it when money's on the line. And let's not forget the Cali Clip, a super convenient, dual-purpose bait clip. Want to find out more? Visit calcoastfishing.com. Hey guys, did you know that Yours Truly is now hosting Lucky Tackle Box's monthly panfish instructionals? And aside from relentless fish catching, I'll be breaking down the rigging and the gear you need to get going along the way. And of course, a few extra tips to help you score more fish on the goodies included in your box. So remember, the tug is our drug. So go visit LuckyTackleBox.com and get signed up today. Attention Northern California anglers, have you been to Boat Country in Escalon with one of the largest selections of welded aluminum fishing boats from North River, Hughes Craft, and now Crestliner? Chances are they have the right boat for you. And did I mention they have a full service center to take care of all your repair or boating maintenance needs? If you're a boat owner or just looking to become one, you owe it to yourself to check these guys out. Visit BoatCountryUSA.com or stop on by. We'll see you there. Did you know that P-Line makes specialized lines for all your fishing needs, from the super strong abrasive resistant CXX or the low stretch super stealthy CX Premium? Or maybe you're looking for invisibility or super bite detection with P-Line's 100% fluorocarbon. No matter what your needs, P-Line's got it covered. To find out more, visit P-Line.com.
P-Line, baby.
Ever tried pulling a planer board next to your boat when trolling or fishing from a swift current bank? If not, you're missing out on one of the most phenomenal fish catching machines on the market today. With Yellowbird planer boards pulling your lines perpendicular to your boat, you can't help but catch more fish. Find out more by visiting www.yellowbirdproducts.com. Now, for the bottom rig of Float and Fly, you can either use the fixed or the slip bobber. The key difference is you're making bottom contact, and I actually ran into this technique by accident a couple of years ago fishing for crappie, and I started crushing bass. I've always known about Float and Fly, but I never really thought to use a float to drag it along the bottom. You may look right here and say, this looks like a little goby or a little juvenile crawdad, and it's a plastic. It's not necessarily a hair fly like Float and Fly applies, but that is just a plastic. So what bottom Float and Fly is, it's called suspension deflection. And what you want to think about it is you're technically suspended, all right? So if you know your depth is 7 feet and you know you have fish at 7 feet, you actually set your leader length to 7 or 7.5 feet. You actually want your fly to land on the bottom. This is a 1/32 ounce Mustad jig head that I have this on right here. If I'm to cast this without a float on 6 or 4 pound line, I may be able to cast it 40, 50 feet max, but on a Float and Fly setup, I can cast it 150, 200 foot with a rocket bobber quite easily. Now, what happens is, this hits the bottom, and this looks like a little juvenile crawfish, so now when I dance the float, I'm almost on a tight line, all right, because I'm setting it at the depth of the bottom or a half a foot or a foot deeper than what I indicate those fish at. If I see 7 foot of depth, I see fish down there in 7 foot, I'm either gonna set it 7.5 or 8 foot of depth. What's going to happen is you're never gonna stay 90 degrees on that angle. You'll never stay 90 degrees. The wind will blow to where your line's always gonna be semi-tight. And what it's gonna do, it's gonna gradually work this little jig along the bottom, and it's so light, you can use anything, 1/32, eighth, all that lighter stuff is naturally gonna find its way around the grass. It's gonna find its way around the rocks, and you shake it. And this is a tactic I like to use for largemouth. Essentially, Float and Fly was for spotted bass and smallmouth bass, but guys started realizing once they were getting deeper, and occasionally they would get the big suspended largemouth to come out and get it. So putting it on the bottom is critical. Now, the reason why I wanted to mention this to you, this year alone, I have multiple 20-pound sacks in the coldest post-frontal, nasty conditions where I couldn't get bit on anything else on that bottom setup for largemouth. Even in the grass, this works. Now, the reason why I told you this one last is because how I'm going to talk to you about the float and reading the float is now going to become subjective to what I'm going to tell you right now. So I have 3 different size rocket bobbers, small, medium, large. They come in all sorts of different colors. The glow in the dark looks really natural. I love using this in all of my colors, or a chartreuse. Any color you want that's gonna stand out to that particular scenario, or watercolor is gonna be your best choice, of course. Always wanna make sure you have a good visual on it. Now, that being said, let's talk about what you need to see with the float. Your float always needs to be sitting close to 90 degrees when your bait is suspended. Now, the reason for that is it means you have enough weight. So the small, medium, and large, the smaller is naturally, the lighter the jig head, the lighter jig, you're gonna want to go to that, you're gonna wanna go to the smaller float to get it to sit at 90 degrees right there. That's funny. I threw it right at my dad behind the camera there. That smaller float with that lighter jig head is gonna stand up easier. If I had a lighter jig head on the big float, it's still gonna be laying sideways. Can I see the bites like that? Yes. But what you need to know by a float laying sideways is what I'm going to tell you right now. As long as your bait is suspended and heavy enough for the float that you have, your float will sit at 90 degrees. If your bait is on the bottom, your float is going to lay over. All right? Now, with that bottom tactic, you want this. This you'll know immediately when you jerk it forward, you're going to see your float sit up until your bait catches up and hits the bottom again. Then it's gonna lay over on its side. Therefore, you know you're making bottom contact, or it'll sit semi-sideways, and you know you're caught in some grass. So you're positive you're making contact with the bottom at all time. Now, that being said, if you're suspended and you know you're fishing in a tree, and all of a sudden your float sits sideways, you may be caught on the tree. But here's a little key indicator in regards to float and fly strikes. Now, imagine your jig sitting right here and your float's at 90 degrees. You have push bites, where a fish runs sideways. You'll see your float just tip over. Anytime your float tips, immediately reel to a tight line. You don't need to set the hook. If all of a sudden you feel fish, reel tighter and lean on him. What is gonna happen is, if he comes sideways, it's gonna tilt. If the fish comes straight up, a bottom bite, an up bite, when they come up and eat it, your float's also gonna lay over sideways. If you have a perfectly round bobber, an up bite shows you nothing. You will see nothing with a perfectly round bobber. This is why a stick bobber or a hybrid, a round / stick bobber like the rocket bobber, is ideal. If he comes up and gets it, it's gonna tip over. You have your strike indicator. If you don't have enough weight to keep this thing at 90 degrees, you're never gonna get that indicator. Because at least you know when you're hitting the bottom, it's gonna lay over. You have no tension. If you wanna hit the bottom, that's also critical that when you're away and you're suspended, that it does sit at 90 degrees, to where if you do wanna do that bottom float and fly, you know exactly what you're touching. So remember, 90 degrees is critical for float and fly, or at least pretty dang close to it. You don't have to be 100% positive, but you need to know if your float tips over, reel, you're either on something, and if you reel, you'll feel if you're snagged, or you'll feel if they're going, and then you need to lean and set the hook. Or if they do that up bite and grab it, it's gonna fall over, and you're gonna get a strike like that, versus a round bobber and a smaller cork bobber. You also don't notice when it's 50 or 60 feet away from you, it actually tipping over. So that's why a longer float is critical. So I'm gonna get into the jigs, the line, the rod. So let's start with the rod right here. A longer rod is better when you're using a fixed float and fly. You can use a 6'6", a 7 if you have a slip bobber. It doesn't really matter. The nicer part though about a longer rod in general is you're gonna get a better hook set the farther you cast it out there. So if you cast 100 feet out there, a longer rod's gonna pick up more line, therefore your hook sets are gonna be better. Now, with that being said, this is 4-pound fluorocarbon line. A lot of people are gonna say, that's too light, fish 8-pound. I will get double with the identical setup, identical fly, fishing 4-pound versus 8-pound, you will get double the amount of strikes. I will bet you $1,000 on it, straight up. Now, the only downside to fishing 4-pound is if they're around trees, you're putting yourself in harm's way. So evaluate this, take this into consideration. You can fish 6 and pull on them a little bit harder and get them out of that tree, but you're gonna get more bites on 4. So think about what's more important. If you're fishing a smaller percentage of trees, maybe you should fish 4-pound because you're gonna be able to execute on fish that are not around trees throughout the day. If you're fishing bluff walls, probably 4 pounds your better choice. If you're fishing around a lot of hang-ups, 6 pounds gonna be your better choice. But 4 and 6 pound are it for float and fly. If you wanna get crazy and fish too, you can go for it. Last month I caught a 6 pounder and a 5 pounder on the 4 pound line, and without breaking the line and really being careful with my drag, the 6 pounder was roughly almost a 7-minute fight because he was digging in grass. So keep that in mind. You have to be patient. You have to run a light drag. Now, what's really critical is that you have a very soft taper on your rod. You need a moderate or a moderate fast action rod. The steelhead rods are great. Really long spinning crappie rods are great. You just want larger guides on there. That's going to be critical for a slip bobber. With a fixed, you don't really need long, big guides. Doesn't really matter too much, only when your bobber stops going back and forth through that line. That's a really critical factor. You don't want a snap hook set. You don't want to jerk it on slight line. You see your float go under real tight and lean. You cannot impact 4 pound line. 4 pound line, an impact on 4 pound line, you could do that, and that could be too dang hard. Reel to a tight line and you'll break off very, very few fish. I've landed tons of big fish on 4 pound line. I have a 17 pound channel catfish I landed on too. So it is very possible. You just have to take your sweet time doing it. A reel, in regards to a reel, this is a smaller one. This happened to be a crappie setup that I'm just showing you with this. This is a 2,000 size. A 3,000 or 4,000 size reel is nice. You want a very audible drag. You need to hear your drag coming off. The reason for that is because of that light line. If you hear your drag coming off, you know to stop reeling. Do not try to back reel and get fancy when float and fly fishing. You need to hear that drag coming off. If you don't hear that drag coming off, you know you can pump them and reel them. If you hear that drag coming off, stop reeling against the fish. You're gonna play him out better, he's gonna exert his energy faster, and you're gonna land more fish that way. So that's the rod, the reel, and the line that I like. The longer you can get away with, the better. All right guys, so I actually did the fixed bobber on my slip float rig right here, which is kind of cool about the rocket bobbers. You can take it off and you can do that if you want. Let's say you find fish shallower than 10 feet and you wanted to try a fixed bobber when you were doing a slip bobber. It's kind of cool. You can still do that option. Now, how do you cast such a long leader? That leader right there, I'm 6'6", it's about 6 foot tall. Now, what's critical is that you have your float in the water with your arm extended. When your float touches, one big lob overhand cast and you catch the spool in your hand before that float hits. And the reason why you catch the spool before your float hits is if your long leader and float land in one spot, it could get twisted up and it could actually physically tie knots in your leader. So as that float's flying in midair and you catch your spool, you're actually stopping it before it hits the water. It's gonna throw your leader out beyond your float and it's gonna land and it's gonna lay your whole rig out nicely at that point. All right guys, now let's talk about the flies or finesse plastics in regards to float and fly. Now, for all your suspended stuff, mostly anything suspended is a bait fish of some sort. You know, you got this little guy here, this little guy here, but what's more critical is the weight. The heaviest I've ever fished on float and fly, I think, is 3/16. Most of the time I'm fishing an 1/8 ounce or lighter. The reason for that is it's more sensitive, it's more natural, it falls slower. When you twitch it, it has much more subtle movement. A heavier bait moves a little bit more erratic. I really don't fish the float and fly when it's any warmer than 55 degrees. I honestly like it when the water's in the 40s. To be honest with you, I find it works really good. But that does not mean that it won't work at all times of year, because it will. Now, I want you to think about this. It's either a gin clear, freezing cold water deal, or it's when it's extremely tough, or when you're milking a spot. That means you came through, you caught a couple fish on it, you threw a Senko on it, and you kept catching big fish with different baits and you ran out of choices. Then you could try to milk it with a float and fly, because believe it or not, it'll work all times of year, but you need some water clarity. If you can't see deeper than 4 feet deep, float and fly may not work too well for you. I've caught them with about visibility of about 2.5 to 3 foot. Any dirtier than that, it's really not gonna work too well. But here's what I want you to keep in mind. Traditionally, the Spro Fat Fly is a very popular float and fly. This happens to be an 1/8 ounce, and I'll show you close-ups of all these. This happens to be an 1/8 ounce, works really well to imitate a shad, okay? The lighter you go, the more natural, subtle movements it's gonna have. If you're doing a slip bobber, I honestly say if you're finding fish 15 feet or deeper, the heavier one's gonna be your deal to get down there and help you fish more confident down and around those fish. If your fish are, 20 feet or shallower, go lighter because it's gonna be more subtle falling through that water column and you're gonna get more bites. I also have this in a bluegill pattern. If you don't have shad or some type of a pond smelt or something, that's probably not your deal right there. If you don't have reflective fish in your system, don't use white. The color white reflects ultraviolet and it looks like a shiny panfish. Use like a green or gold or amber, something that looks more like a bluegill. If you have a little greenery to your water and you want to try it, or if you want to fish something different and everybody's pounding it, use a bright, flashy color like that right there. A lot of the time just showing those fish something different is gonna get those bites. If you're doing a pendulum under a fixed bobber, use like a little shad head, like that guy there, with a little boot tail. This happens to be a BWAS submission. And what I'm doing, I'm talking about the pendulum tactic. If I have 7 foot of line out, I'll pull my float 7 feet and I'll let this catch up. It's gonna lift up and it's gonna swim down naturally as it's penduluming, which is gonna get you a ton of bites around bridge columns. That's amazing. Now, one thing that I never see anybody doing, I'm sure somebody's doing it in the Midwest. You guys are all amazing floating flyers out in the Midwest. Out West Coast, it's still relatively new over the last 5 years. This is a Roadrunner with an underspin on there. Now, if you're throwing a floating fly that's with a slip bobber, that's falling down 20 or 30 feet and you're throwing it up to bridge columns, that underspin is going to catch you a ton of spotted bass and smallmouth falling down those bluffs, bridge pilings, anything you want. That little underspin is a killer. Now, when it comes to bottom suspension deflection, or the bottom float and fly, like I like to talk about, recently I've been playing with the Strike King half shell. I cut it in half. The Strike King half shell plastic is neutrally buoyant. So the cool part is, if you do happen to hop it up off the bottom, it doesn't fall back. It is so subtle and natural moving, it's beautiful. If I have a lot of gobies, I'm fishing that Strike King half shell. Looks perfect. Juvenile crawdads, most people don't know, crawdads under 2.5 inches really don't burrow. They love going in the grass, and they look like this little deal right here. I've been very silent about giving this away. This has been 2 years. I talked about it at the International Sportsman Expo on my seminars. This is the crappie magnet. It's made by the same people of Trout Magnet. I have no affiliation to any of these guys. I don't get paid by any of these guys. I want you guys to go out and catch fish and be thrilled. This is the crappie magnet right here. This is watermelon red flake on a 1/32 ounce jig head. I have put up, just this year alone, I think I had 6 bags on the float and fly, over mid-20s to 25 plus pounds on that deal alone, doing that bottom float and fly tactic. I greatly hope this video helped you guys out. Get out there, play around with this rig. I'm not knocking anybody who's made previous videos. They all had good information in it. I just wanted to give you guys basically a master class of this technique that's really cool, and it's a hell of a fish catcher under the toughest conditions. Appreciate you guys watching. Informative Fisherman on Instagram, Facebook, and informativefisherman.com. Guys, check me out. We'll see you next time.